Treasure of the Sierra Madre is a 1948 film starring Humphrey Bogart, Walter Huston, and Tim Holt, and was written and directed by John Huston. When three men venture into the Sierra Madre mountains of Mexico to try their hand at prospecting, none of them predicted what would happen when they strike gold. Well, maybe one of them had an idea. What follows is a descent into mistrust, madness, and murder. The Treasure of the Sierra Madre is one of those movies that almost everyone agrees is an undisputed classic. I've seen it before, but it was a very, very long time ago. I've never really done much reading or research about it, but I knew it features an iconic Humphrey Bogart performance and has an extremely quotable and easy to misquote line about stinking badges. So going in this time, I really wanted to see if I could figure out why this film has been added to that list of movies that are known as the best of all time. And I think it comes down to a few things. Like a lot of great movies, it can be enjoyed on a couple of different levels. First and foremost, it is an absolutely first-rate, rugged adventure film. It's filled with great dialogue, well-shot action scenes, interesting characters, and is just so engrossing. But when you dig just a little deeper, there are so many themes running through this movie. The most obvious one is greed, and this movie illustrates the love of wealth and how it can change and twist a person into something unrecognizable. The best example is Humphrey Bogart's character of Fred She Dobbs. I really wish I could do a proper impression of him, but his character goes through the biggest change, and it's one he can't really escape. Early on, during the scene where we first meet Howard, played by Walter Huston, Dobbs is so vocal about how he would behave if he ever struck it rich. He would take only what he needed, leave, and be satisfied with that. And this is just after Howard has laid out what he has witnessed in other men, when they find themselves in this very tempting situation. And later, Dobbs follows that same course. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stemming from greed is also paranoia and the breakdown of relationships that can occur when riches are involved. There's also trust, and that crops up in the movie over and over again. And on the flip side, betrayal. Trust is shown when Dobbs and Curtin take the job working for Barton McLean's character, and he turns on them. And then the trust that is initially agreed upon between the three men as they begin their expedition is tested and eventually falls apart once the dollar value begins to increase exponentially. And finally, in Dobbs' encounter with the bandits, once he is all alone, and he attempts the same scam that Barton McLean once pulled on him. Each of these situations results in shifting loyalties and a fear and mistrust of each other. And all of this is laid out flawlessly in John Huston's script, for which, appropriately I would say, he won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay. Also, he won for Best Director that year. I don't think I'm saying anything too original in this statement, but John Huston is an amazing director and brings out such mesmerizing performances from his cast. And not just here. Throughout this period, there are so many classics. It's still hard for me to believe that The Maltese Falcon was his first movie, but after that, Key Largo, The Asphalt Jungle, all of these especially deal with complex characters, many of them villains or ones with shady motivations or pasts, and he's so skilled at presenting ensembles where there is some conflict or tension between them. And Treasure of the Sierra Madre is no exception. As I've said, Humphrey Bogart's performance is amazing, and it's also fascinating because of the heights it goes to and also the subtleties contained in it. The character arc that Fred C. Dobbs goes through is again quite drastic. He begins the movie very humbly, begging for pennies, always going to the same American in the white suit, played by John Huston in his very famous cameo. But then, once his character starts to change, is when Humphrey Bogart really digs in and turns Dobbs into a frightening, unhinged man. The scene where he catches Curtin in the act of accidentally finding his goods, as the gold is called many times, gets very suspenseful, and the paranoia that has gripped the man rears its head. Similarly, in the scene where each man ends up leaving camp at different points during the night, Humphrey Bogart is scary. Not always necessarily because of what he's doing, but because we aren't sure what he might do. And that line he walks between sanity and madness is so thin. He begins talking to himself, becoming ever more distrustful of his partners, and the one scene that was so interesting to try and understand what was going through his mind is after Cody, played by Bruce Bennett, is killed. The expression on his face as Tim Holt reads the letter is so hard to place. It's not remorse, it's not relief, he's almost expressionless, but not quite. But whatever it is, he does level out to some degree after that, although he doesn't agree to leave any money to Cody's widow as the other two do. Howard seems to be a calming influence of some kind on him, and it's after Howard leaves Dobbs and Curtin alone to carry on that his paranoia returns, and he very quickly contemplates murdering his one-time friend. Humphrey Bogart takes this role and shows us a man who is a lot more easily influenced than he initially believed himself to be, and has a weakness and fear within him that his tough guy instincts and posturing belie. It's a complex character that is portrayed incredibly, and it's surprising that he wasn't even nominated for an Oscar that year. But a man who was nominated and won for Best Supporting Actor is Walter Huston, the director's father, and a very well-regarded actor himself long before this film, playing Howard. And it's no surprise that he won the Oscar. He too gives a fantastic performance, and a fun one too. Right from that first scene of his I mentioned, I noticed his cadence and how he speaks fast, barely taking a breath, and it's so unusual. I just loved it. Each of the three main characters are so unique and represent a different type of person. Howard is a wise, older man who, at least in the prospecting sense, has seen it all. He's made and lost fortunes, seen many other men do the same thing, so as a result, he isn't quite as excited as the other two when they find gold, and doesn't find himself being sucked into this thrilling experience quite as quickly, because he knows it can be snatched away just as suddenly. He still hides his goods like the others do, but he never gets overtaken by the greed. And in contrast, he actually shows great humanity. When some native people from the mountains need help, he goes, leaving his gold to be watched over by his partners. The scenes of Howard trying to revive the injured boy are what start to show the heart and moral of this film, which I'll talk about towards the end of the review. But before that, the closest Howard comes to joining Dobbs as another despicable character in this movie is when the three men decide to vote on just what they're going to do with Cody, an outsider who has discovered their little mining operation and wants a cut going forward. And that brings me to Tim Holt, playing Curtin, the young man who initially befriends Dobbs when they get jobs together building oil rigs. Tim Holt is such an interesting actor to me because of the unique way his career worked. His bread and butter was making many B-westerns all through the 40s and into the early 50s. I've seen a handful of them, I own most of the rest, and I think they're quite good. But every once in a while, he'd get a chance to show up in a big budget A picture, whether that be The Magnificent Ambersons from Orson Welles, a movie I really enjoy. It features a great Joseph Cotten performance, and I really wish there would have been a way to see the full, uncut version. But anyway. Or he might be one of the Earp brothers in John Ford's My Darling Clementine, or suddenly appear in His Kind of Woman, a terrific comedy film noir starring Robert Mitchum. I really need to mark that one down for an upcoming review. All this is to say that whereas most B-Western cowboys had that particular genre locked down and stayed put within it, somehow Tim Holt caught the eye of several very high-profile directors, and as a result ended up in a handful of classic movies. And of those, this is probably his best remembered role out of his whole career. He brings an earnest, almost innocent demeanor to the character in his early scenes, but pretty quickly we can see he is not one to be trifled with. But overall, he seems to be a good guy. Definitely more level-headed than Dobbs, which is why it's so shocking when the vote about Cody takes place. Dobbs, and even Howard, elect to kill Cody to preserve the secrecy of their mine. But surely, you're thinking, Curtin will steer them away from that. But no, he agrees with them, and the scene of them slowly walking up behind Cody, all with guns drawn, is eerie and kind of unsettling. Because at this point, we're trying to identify and see the good in at least a couple of these men. But the businesslike way they all make this decision makes you reconsider all of them. And I think the reason that scene works as well as it does is Tim Holt. Because without him, the other two seem like they could be capable of it. Howard is somewhat mysterious. He might have committed such a thing in the past and is justifying this action somehow. But when the guy we see as most relatable takes a turn to the bad, it brings into focus the fact that anyone could have the capacity for something like this. and that's a terrifying fact to be confronted with. Interesting to note is the fact that Tim Holt's father, Jack Holt, has a cameo in the first scene with Howard. He's a little hard to recognize in comparison to his days back when he was a Western movie star himself, but it's fun that he was able to appear with his son. Also in the cast is Alfonso Bedoya, playing the bandit leader nicknamed Gold Hat. He's a fairly funny character actor, but that humorous exterior here is simply a mask for a brutal killer. Of course, that "we ain't got no badges" scene is justifiably famous. And finally, little Robert Blake shows up as the boy who sells Humphrey Bogart the lottery ticket that spurs them on to buying their prospecting supplies. Something I really appreciate about this movie is the score. Right from the moment the credits begin at the start, the theme hits you and carries on through a very stirring track throughout the whole opening. Now, it's a great score in a Warner Brothers movie. I wonder who was behind that. You guessed it, Max Steiner. I think he's an incredible composer, and his work just adds so much atmosphere in some sequences, or thunderous propulsion to action scenes. Warner Brothers was so fortunate to have him, and he's an interesting constant that ties so many classic films from that studio together. The whole movie is beautifully filmed and was one of the first major Hollywood movies shot outside of the US. I think it does a great job of portraying heat really well. And seeing these men get scruffier and dirtier as they sweat through endless long days was very convincing. Certain shots and lighting are just gorgeous, like the one where Dobbs and Curtin are walking through the flophouse. Oh, and I have to mention the fight scene where those two confront Barton McLean and demand their pay that he somehow forgot to give them. That fight is shot so well with lots of low angles, the blown out windows behind them, and the choreography of it is excellent. What I loved especially is the fact that we see the tide turn in a sense during the fight. At first, Barton McLean is easily taking on both Humphrey Bogart and Tim Holt. He's much taller, outweighs either man by a good deal, and they are shown to be not overly skilled in the art of pugilism. But as the fight carries on, we see McLean getting more and more tired, and the two men really lay into him. It gets pretty vicious, and even though the transitions between shots with stuntmen and those with the actors themselves are pretty obvious, it's still so great. And the end of that scene, where Dobbs goes through his wallet and takes only what is owed them, is an interesting contrast to the money-obsessed man that he becomes. While we're on that, I really noticed this time how casually the amount of money each man hopes to get out of the mine increases. Early on, I think it's around $5,000 each, and shortly after, they're mentioning hitting $25,000 apiece, and then calling it quits. And finally, they decide to pack up and leave once they're all over $35,000, rather than the $40,000 as they discussed earlier, they say. It's a nice subtle way to show us how all three of them have changed and are finding it harder to walk away. I think it's during one of those conversations that they discuss what they're each planning to do with their share. And without getting into the ending too much, what's so great is that Howard and Curtin's plans don't even require the fortunes they've amassed, which is handy given how things turn out. Howard would like to settle down, maybe have a little store, but the main thing is to relax and never prospect again. Curtin would like to live on a fruit farm, recalling memories of his childhood. And now we come back to what I was mentioning about the moral of this story. Because while we don't see it play out, we're led to believe that both men will get what they were looking for. So after we've seen how greed can warp and tear people apart, we're shown that wealth isn't necessary for people to be happy. And that was a great message, and a nice surprise. It shows how long it's been since I last watched this film, because in my memory, there was not a happy ending of any kind. And I guess if the movie had ended where I remembered it ending, it would not have. The Treasure of the Sierra Madre is a very entertaining, beautifully made film that is well deserving of its reputation. The direction, the performances, the pacing, everything about this movie is top-notch. Highly recommended. Thanks for watching this review. If you enjoyed it, head on over to my channel, Hildebrand Productions. Thanks again, and adios for now.